A single misplaced digit on a transfer form put me in a locked room with 40 alien super soldiers who each stood a foot and a half taller than me. Every one of them stopped what they were doing at once. Every one of them turned, and every one of them started walking straight toward me. My name is Ronald Pendleton. I did not mean to join the most dangerous all-female regiment in the known galaxy. I did not mean to become the only human inside a matriarchal warband whose idea of a warm greeting is checking whether you can still stand after they hit you. But I did join them. And by the end of this story, they didn't just accept me into their ranks. They went to war to keep me. If there is one universal truth in this galaxy, it's that military bureaucracy is more dangerous than anything you'll face on the battlefield. It doesn't matter whether you serve the Terran Coalition, the Interstellar Alliance, or anyone else flying a flag out here. A clerk with a data pad and a bad attitude can end your career, your safety, and apparently your entire life, faster than a sniper with a plasma rifle ever could. This is the story of how one of those clerks accidentally handed me over to the Kalari Vanguard, and how I spent the next month proving that being underestimated is the most dangerous mistake anyone can make. Stick around because this one gets very, very strange. 6 months before any of this happened, I was a standard combat engineer attached to the 104th Mechanized Infantry, serving under General Hayes. My job was simple, in the way that defusing an unexploded warhead is simple. I turned wrenches. I dug trenches. I occasionally had to figure out in under 90 seconds how to keep a runaway fusion reactor from turning a city block into a smoking hole in the ground. I was good at that job. I want to be clear about that, because being good at your job in the Terran military doesn't get you a promotion. It gets you reassigned somewhere the brass thinks you're needed more, whether you like it or not. My orders were supposed to send me to the 4th Engineering Battalion on Aegis Prime, a sprawling joint species forward operating base sitting right on the edge of contested space. Everyone who'd served there told me the same thing: easiest posting in the sector. Fix some atmospheric scrubbers. Recalibrate a few automated defense turrets. Drink synthetic coffee that tastes like scorched plastic until your contract runs out. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. Instead, a logistics officer named Peterson, a man whose competence I will be questioning for the rest of my natural life, mistyped a single line on my transfer authorization. Where it should have read 4th Engineering Battalion, it read 4th Vanguard. Nobody caught it. Not the shuttle crew, not the departure clerk, not even the automated manifest system that's supposed to flag exactly this kind of error. I didn't find out until I was already 3 days into transit, and by then it was too late to do anything but ride it out. The air on Aegis Prime hit me the moment the cargo bay doors opened heavy, thick with ozone and the acrid tang of promethium fuel. I hoisted my duffel bag over one shoulder and stepped down the ramp expecting the usual welcoming committee. A couple of grease-stained mechanics, a bored quartermaster with a clipboard, maybe a sergeant yelling at somebody about paperwork. What I found instead was Sector 7. Sector 7 wasn't an engineering depot. It was a heavily fortified compound, its walls draped floor to ceiling in crimson and silver banners bearing a sigil I didn't recognize yet but would come to know very, very well. Twin blast doors, each easily 4 meters tall, dominated the entrance, flanked by sentry turrets that tracked my movement the second I crossed into their scan radius. I checked my data pad 3 times, convinced I'd misread the coordinates. I hadn't. The Kalari are a species the Terran Coalition allied with almost a decade ago, back before I ever put on a uniform. On paper, the Alliance briefing I'd sat through during basic training made them sound almost quaint, a matriarchal stratocracy. Males kept at home to manage civil infrastructure, while the females served in the military. In practice, nothing in that briefing prepared me for what they actually looked like standing in front of me. Kalari females average just over 2 meters in height. Their skin runs a dense, ash-gray tone, stretched over musculature that looks less like human muscle and more like something engineered for a specific, brutal purpose. Their eyes carry a faint bioluminescent glow, shifting in intensity with mood, something I would learn to read like a threat indicator over the following weeks. And the 4th Vanguard, as I was about to discover, wasn't just any Kelari unit. It was their most elite, most decorated, and most exclusively female combat regiment in the entire theater. I held my data pad up to the biometric SC. Anner at the blast doors, half hoping it would reject me and send me quietly on my way to the engineering depot where I belonged. It didn't. The scanner beeped green. The massive doors ground open with a hydraulic hiss that sounded uncomfortably final, and I stepped through into the barracks beyond. The doors sealed shut behind me before I'd taken 3 steps. The room went dead silent. I mean that literally. Every sound in that barracks stopped at once. Weapons maintenance kits clattered onto workbenches. A sparring match in the center training ring froze mid-throw, 2 warriors staring at me over each other's shoulders. 40-some pairs of glowing eyes turned toward the door, toward me, and did not look away. I am 6'1". Back home, that's tall enough to get asked if I play basketball. In that room, surrounded by women who each had at least a foot of height and God only knows how much raw strength on me, I felt like a toddler who had wandered into an enclosure full of apex predators during feeding time. A figure separated herself from the back of the room and closed the distance in a handful of unhurried strides. She was taller than the others around her ash-gray skin marked with a network of jagged white scar tissue that told its own story before she ever opened her mouth. A translator collar sat at her throat, glowing a faint, steady blue, the device responsible for turning Kelari vocalizations into serviceable Terran English. Her uniform carried the insignia of a commander. Her registered coalition name, I would soon learn, was Diana. "What?" she said, her voice a low rumble I felt more than heard, vibrating somewhere behind my sternum, "is a human male doing in my staging area?" I held up my data pad like it was a shield. "Reporting for duty, ma'am. Ronald Pendleton, transferred from the 104th. She didn't take the pad. She leaned down instead, close enough that I caught the smell of cordite and something sharp and metallic underneath it, and looked at me the way you'd look at something you'd stepped in. "This is the Vanguard," she said. "We are the tip of the spear. We do not babysit fragile Terran engineers." "I can see that, Commander," I said, and I wanted on record that my voice only cracked a little. "But my orders are verified through Central Command. Until the bureaucracy processes a correction, which historically runs 3 to 4 weeks, I am, technically, part of this unit." A murmur went through the room. A broad-shouldered warrior stepped forward, a plasma cannon slung over one shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. Her translator identified her as Sergeant Lyra. "Let me break him, Commander," Lyra said, her tone almost bored. "We tell Command he slipped in the gravity chamber. Saves everyone the liability of carrying him into the field." I felt my stomach drop somewhere around my boots, but I kept my voice level. "With respect, Sergeant, I've survived the trench lines at Orion. I'm not looking for a fight, but I'm not going to be broken either." Diana studied me for a long moment, long enough that I genuinely considered whether I just talked myself into a body bag. Then she barked out a laugh, sharp and sudden, that echoed off the steel bulkheads. "Orion," she repeated, straightening to her full height and crossing her arms. "Fine. You want to play soldier, Pendleton, you stay, but there are no accommodations for your species here. You eat what we eat. You train how we train, and if you fall behind, we will leave you exactly where you fall." She turned her back on me, a gesture I'd later understand was as much a dismissal as it was a test, and the rest of the unit slowly returned to their business, though I could feel eyes tracking me all the way to an empty bunk tucked into the corner of the barracks. I dropped my bag onto a rigid metal cot and sat down hard, staring at the crimson banners overhead. I was a human combat engineer, alone, in an alien sisterhood of professional killers. And somewhere back on Aegis Prime, Peterson was probably filing paperwork without the faintest idea what he'd just done to my life. Before any of that, though, I should explain where that rule about engineers and broken lines actually came from, because it matters later. General Hayes wasn't the kind of officer who gave inspirational speeches. He was the kind who showed up covered in the same mud as everyone else and fixed what needed fixing without waiting for someone to ask him to. I served under him for 2 years before the transfer, most of it spent digging fortified positions along the Orion Trench lines, while enemy artillery made a genuine effort to turn us into paste. During one particularly bad night, a support strut on our forward command bunker took a direct hit and started to fail with 11 people still inside, Hayes included. Every trained procedure said evacuate and let the structure go. Hayes grabbed a torch and a spare girder instead, and he made it very clear that anyone who wanted to leave could, but he wasn't going anywhere until the bunker held. I stayed. We got it stabilized with about 4 minutes to spare before the whole thing would have come down on our heads. Afterward, sitting in the mud outside what was left of the bunker, he told me something I never forgot. Doesn't matter what your rank patch says, Pendleton. When the line breaks, somebody has to become the thing holding it together, and it's usually not the person everyone expected. Remember that when it's your turn. I didn't understand what he meant, not really, until I was standing in a courtyard on Ceti Alpha with a fusion reactor's safety limiters in my hands and an alien commander bleeding out at my feet. I understood it perfectly then. The next 3 weeks were, without exaggeration, a master class in pain. I learned quickly that the Kalari don't consider a training session successful unless somebody's bleeding by the end of it. Their morning routine started at 400 hours sharp with a 10-mile run through the base's gravity simulator. Earth standard gravity sits at 1 g. The simulator, calibrated for Kalari physiology, ran at 1.8 g on my first morning. I genuinely thought my knees were going to give out somewhere around mile 2. Every step felt like I was hauling an invisible pack loaded with lead plates. The Kalari jogged through it like it was a light warm-up, their long strides swallowing distance I had to fight for. I fell behind almost immediately. My lungs burned. My heart hammered against my ribs like something trying to escape. Sergeant Lyra lapped me without breaking a sweat. "Keep moving, Terran," she said, not even glancing back. "Or should I have someone fetch you a wheeled cart?" I didn't answer. I couldn't spare the breath. I put my head down and focused on the rhythmic slap of my boots against the deck plating, one step, then another, then another. Here's the thing about humans that most alien species out here consistently underestimate. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy. We're not the fastest. We're certainly not the most durable in a straight fight. But evolution handed us one advantage almost nobody else has, and it's a nastier one than it sounds. We are persistence hunters. Our bodies are built to sweat, to shed heat efficiently, to keep functioning long after stronger, faster animals have run themselves into lactic acid collapse. Somewhere in a hot savanna a few 100,000 years ago, our ancestors used to run animals to death because they simply refused to stop moving. That instinct never left us. By mile 7, the taunts from the Kalari running near me had started to thin out. Their heavy, muscle-dense frames retained heat far worse than mine did, and I could see it in the way their strides shortened, their breathing turned ragged. By mile 9, several of them had dropped to a heavy, labored march. I was still running. Badly. Ugly, shuffling, half-stumbling, but running. When we crossed the finish line, I collapsed onto the steel grating, gasping, my vision swimming with black spots at the edges. A shadow fell across me, blotting out the overhead lights. Specialist Harper, the squad's scout leaner than the others, with intense amber eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of motion in a room, crouched down beside me and offered a canteen of electrolyte slurry that tasted like battery acid mixed with lime. "You did not die," she observed, sounding genuinely surprised by the fact. "Not today," I managed, drinking it anyway. Your biology is inefficient, Harper said, poking my shoulder with one thick, clawed finger. You leak water from your skin constantly, and yet your endurance is anomalous. The commander believed you would quit by mile 3. Tell the commander I'm just getting warmed up, I lied, and somewhere underneath the pain I meant it. The physical side of things was only half the battle, though, and honestly, it might have been the easier half. The Kelari operate on a rigid social hierarchy built almost entirely around demonstrated dominance and physical capability. As a small, male outsider, I started at the very bottom of that ladder and had to claw my way up 1 inch at a time. I got bumped to the back of every mess hall line. During weapons drills, I was handed the faulty power cells nobody else wanted to deal with. My gear got accidentally misplaced more than once. But I'm an engineer. When brute strength fails you, you find leverage instead. During the second week, during a live-fire tactical simulation meant to test the squad's coordinated defense protocols, the heavy turret anchoring our position jammed at the worst possible moment. Sergeant Lyra was screaming into the comms, trying to manually cycle the plasma chamber while stun rounds hissed past her position from the simulated opposing force. "The coupling is fused," she roared, slamming her armored fist against the turret housing. "We're losing our suppression in." Glee. I broke cover and sprinted across open ground, stun rounds cracking the air uncomfortably close to my head, and dove into the trench beside her, multi-tool already in hand. "Get out of here, human," Lyra snarled without looking at me. "This is heavy artillery, not a toy." "Shut up and give me 5 seconds. She didn't have time to argue. I ripped the secondary access panel off the turret housing and got my hands on the internal wiring. Kelari weapon systems are brilliant in terms of raw destructive output, but their cycling mechanisms are needlessly, almost stubbornly complex, built for maximum firepower with zero thought given to field repair. I rerouted the power feed from the cooling jacket directly into the firing pin, bypassing the fused coupling entirely. "Fire it now," I said. Lyra didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger, and the turret screamed back to life, spitting a torrent of blue plasma downrange and obliterating the simulated enemy position in seconds. The barrel glowed white-hot without its cooling jacket, but it held together just long enough to win us the exercise. When it was over, Lyra looked down at the smoking turret, then down at me. She didn't say thank you. I would learn over the following weeks that Kelari almost never do, but she also didn't shove me out of the chow line that evening. In that unit, I came to understand that silence was as close to gratitude as you were going to get, and it meant something. Bit by bit, incident by incident, I carved out a niche for myself. I would never win a fistfight against any of them, and I stopped trying to prove otherwise. Instead, I became the squad's fixer. A grav pack whining out of alignment, I tuned it. A helmet HUD glitching mid-patrol, I rewired it on the spot. Slowly, the word human started getting replaced, in conversation and in tone, with my actual name. Not every challenge to my place in the unit came from outside it. Late in the second week, a Kelari corporal named Thessa, younger than most of the squad, ambitious in the specific way junior soldiers get when they think the fastest path up the ladder runs directly over somebody weaker, issued a formal challenge during evening drills. Under Kelari custom, any warrior can contest another standing within the pack through ritual combat, provided the challenge is declared openly and the commanding officer permits it. Thessa declared hers loudly enough that the entire training yard stopped to watch. "The human holds a place he did not earn through combat," she announced, circling me with the loose, confident gait of someone who'd already decided how this was going to end. I challenge his standing. Diana, watching from the edge of the yard, could have shut it down with a single word. She didn't. I understood later that she was testing something too, whether the unit's growing respect for me could survive contact with an actual, sanctioned fight, not just a training accident or a lucky field repair. I had no illusions about winning a straight combat match against a Kalari corporal built to snap Terran bone like kindling. So I didn't fight her the way she wanted to be fought. When she came at me, I dropped low instead of squaring up, used her own momentum to redirect her past me into the padded barrier at the edge of the ring, and had a training baton pressed against the back of her neck before she'd fully recovered her footing. Combat isn't only about strength, Corporal, I said, breathing hard, offering her a hand up she didn't take. It's about what breaks first. I'm not trying to outmuscle anyone here. I never was. Thessa stared at me for a long moment, then let out a short, sharp exhale that I'd learned was the Kalari equivalent of a grudging laugh. Leverage, she said. Clever, cheap, effective. She didn't apologize, Kalari don't, the same way they don't say thank you, but she also never challenged me again, and within a week she'd started quietly copying the redirect technique into her own sparring sessions. Diana caught my eye across the yard afterward and gave the smallest possible nod. I didn't know it yet, but I just passed the last real test standing between me and being considered, however grudgingly, one of them. There was one more Kalari worth mentioning from those weeks, a heavy weapons specialist named Vex, built even broader than Lyra, who spent the better part of 2 weeks refusing to acknowledge my existence at all. Vex didn't taunt me. She didn't threaten me. She simply treated me like empty air, which was somehow worse. It wasn't until the 3rd week, when I rebuilt the recoil dampener on her cannon after she'd all but given up on it, that she finally looked directly at me and said exactly 4 words. Efficient. Do it again. That was, apparently, high praise. Not everyone on Aegis Prime warmed to the idea of a human bunking down in Sector 7, though. About halfway through my 2nd week, I got dragged into the joint mess hall for a mandatory cross-unit briefing, and a Terran sergeant named Doyle from a nearby infantry company decided to make an example out of me in front of a room full of soldiers. Heard the Vanguard picked up a mascot, Doyle said loudly enough for 3 tables to hear, grinning at his squad. They dress you up yet, Pendleton, give you a little collar. I kept eating. Doyle didn't take the hint. Real question is what you're doing for them, he pressed, stepping closer. Because word around the depot is those things eat their support staff when supplies run short. You sure you're not just rationed muscle with a rifle attached? I felt the air in the room shift before I even heard the footsteps. Harper had been 3 tables over, technically off duty, technically not my problem to manage. She crossed the mess hall in about 4 strides and set one hand flat on the table beside my tray, not touching Doyle, not threatening him outright, just present. In the specific way a loaded weapon is present. Say it again, she said, voice level, translator flattening the growl underneath it into something almost polite. I want to make certain I understood the insult correctly before I decide how much of it matters. Doyle's grin didn't survive the next 5 seconds. He mumbled something about being late for a briefing and left with his tray still half full. I looked up at Harper, who was already turning to walk away like nothing had happened. You didn't have to do that, I said. I did not do it for you, she said, without looking back. I did it because a squad that permits its own to be insulted unanswered is a squad inviting worse. I decided not to argue with the logic, mostly because I suspected it wasn't entirely true, and mostly because I didn't want to find out what would happen if I pushed on it. That same week, I pulled first watch alongside Commander Diana, an assignment I was fairly sure had been engineered rather than randomly rotated, though nobody in that unit ever admitted to engineering anything. We sat on the upper gantry overlooking the motor pool, the base quiet except for the distant hum of the perimeter shield generators. You could have requested reassignment the first night, Diana said, not looking at me, eyes fixed on the dark tree line beyond the fence. Central Command would have granted it. A clerical error easily corrected, no shame attached. Would it have looked that way to your unit, though, I asked, if I'd tapped out on night 1? She was quiet long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. No, she admitted finally. It would have confirmed everything they already believed about your species. Fragile, temporary, not worth the investment of respect. So I didn't really have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Ronald, she said, and for the first time since I'd met her, there was something almost gentle underneath the words. You simply made the harder one. We didn't talk much after that, but it was the first night I didn't lie awake afterward turning over how many ways the deployment could still go wrong. Acceptance in the barracks, though, is one thing. Trust in the field is an entirely different animal, and on the 22nd day of my deployment, I found out exactly how different. The klaxons went off in the middle of a meal cycle, bathing the entire barracks in flashing crimson emergency light. Vanguard, armor up. Commander Diana's voice cut through the intercom, flat and hard in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Distress signal from Outpost Charlie. The Skrell have breached the perimeter. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. The Skrell. I'd heard the briefings, same as everyone else. A subterranean insectoid species that swarmed like locusts and tore through standard-issue armor plating like it was wet cardboard. My stomach dropped somewhere around my boots for the second time since arriving on Aegis Prime. I scrambled to my locker, strapped into my hazard suit, and locked a Terran-issue pulse rifle into my shoulder harness. Around me, the Vanguard moved with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. No wasted motion, no panic, just 40 women converting from resting soldiers into instruments of war in under 4 minutes. The atmosphere aboard the dropship on the way down was suffocating. The Kelari sat in silence, eyes forward, running through pre-combat breathing rituals I didn't have a name for. Commander Diana walked the aisle checking harnesses and stopped when she reached my seat. Pendleton, she said, and the booming command voice was gone, replaced by something quieter. This isn't an engineering run. The Skrell take no prisoners. They consume. I know, I said, checking my rifle's charge indicator for the third time. Stay in the center of the formation, she ordered. Do not attempt to be a hero. Keep the comms open and your head down. Understood. Understood, Commander. The dropship lurched hard as it detached from orbital transit. Plunging toward the dusty, hostile surface of Ceti Alpha. I gripped the safety restraints until my knuckles went white, and as the hull shook violently under atmospheric entry, I remember thinking that I had survived the bureaucracy, survived the training, and had absolutely no idea what was coming next. The landing was less a touchdown and more a controlled crash. The moment the bay doors slammed open into a ramp, Diana was already roaring the order. Move, move, move. We surged out into a nightmare. Outpost Charlie had been a mining and communications relay, tucked into a deep canyon on the planet's surface. It was supposed to be heavily fortified. Instead, it was a slaughterhouse. Thick black smoke poured from the primary fusion generator at the compound's center. The sky overhead sat in an ugly, bruised purple, and the air stank of sulfur and burning synthetic polymer. Spread out, defensive perimeter, Sergeant Lyra commanded, her plasma cannon already whirring up to full charge. I stuck close to Specialist Harper, my pulse rifle feeling laughably small next to the heavy ordnance the rest of the squad was carrying. We advanced through the ruined courtyard in near-total silence. No bodies, human or Kelari. Just massive, jagged holes torn straight through steel plating that should have withstood far worse. I don't like this, Harper murmured over comms, her amber eyes darting through the shadows. Seismic sensors are erratic, too much interference. Push toward the command center, Diana ordered. We extract the data drives before the Skrell can get to them. The ground beneath us gave way all at once. It didn't happen gradually. 1 second we were standing on solid plating. The next, the earth simply opened, and shrieking chitinous horrors poured out of the crater beneath us. The Skrell moved with terrifying, scuttling speed for something the size of a small vehicle, their scythe-like forelimbs sparking with visible bioelectric current. Ambush formed the ring, Diana screamed, already firing. Off to my right, Vex had already dropped to one knee, her heavy cannon roaring in short, disciplined bursts instead of the wild suppression fire everyone else was laying down. Even in the chaos, I noticed it. She wasn't shooting at what was closest. She was shooting at whatever was about to breach the weakest point in our line, tracking the swarm's structure instead of just the nearest target. It was the kind of discipline that should have been impossible to hold on to, with the ground itself trying to eat you. And it bought the rest of us maybe 4 extra seconds we badly needed. The vanguard reacted with an efficiency that, even in the middle of pure terror, I found myself admiring. They collapsed into a tight defensive circle, a wall of gray muscle and heavy armor, and laid down a punishing, coordinated barrage of plasma and kinetic fire. I was shoved into the center of that ring alongside the squad's communications tech, a smaller Kelari named Sky who I hadn't gotten to know well before that moment, and I'll admit, was terrified I wasn't going to get the chance to. I raised my rifle and fired into the swarm. My rounds punched clean through Skrell carapace, but for every one that dropped screaming and thrashing in a spray of green fluid, 3 more crawled over the corpse to take its place. "They're flanking left," Lyra shouted, her cannon starting to overheat from sustained fire. That's when a massive, heavily armored Skrell warrior launched itself off the ruined watchtower behind us, sailing clean over the front line and landing inside our defensive ring, directly beside Commander Diana. She didn't have time to bring her rifle up. The Skrell's bioelectric scythe opened her chest plate like it was tearing paper. Diana went down hard, a guttural roar of pain tearing out of her as thick, dark blue blood spilled into the dust. The formation shattered instantly. Seeing their commander fall sent a visible shockwave of panic through the entire unit, and the Skrells surged to exploit it. "Commander!" Harper screamed, trying to fight her way toward Diana, only to get pinned by 2 Skrell drones snapping their mandibles at her faceplate. I didn't think. If I'd stopped to think, I would have stayed exactly where I was, in the center of the formation, doing what I was told, and Diana would have died in that courtyard. But General Hayes had drilled one rule into me back on Earth before any of this, before Peterson's typo ever sent me here. Engineers fix broken things. If the line breaks, you become the mortar holding it together. I sprinted forward, ducked under the sweeping arc of a Skrell scythe, and grabbed Diana by her shoulder harness. She was easily 300 pounds in full armor, but adrenaline does strange things to what your body considers possible. I dragged her backward out of the immediate kill zone, firing one-handed into the face of the Skrell that had struck her down. "Get off me, human," Dia choked out, trying to shove me away even as blood soaked through the sealant I was slapping over her chest wound. "Leave me." "Shut up, Commander," I snapped, foam sealant expanding fast enough to slow the bleeding. I looked up at the courtyard, and the word that came to mind was foobar. Lyra was out of ammo, reduced to bludgeoning Skrell with the barrel of her own cannon. Harper was barely holding off 2 drones at once. Sky was down, dragging herself backward with a shattered leg brace. We were going to die in that courtyard, unless somebody changed the rules of the fight, and there was nobody left standing who could do that except me. "Lyra, Harper, fall back to the generator housing," I screamed over the open channel. "Are you insane? We do not yield the courtyard," Lyra roared back. "Do it or we all die here," I yelled, hauling Diana up and throwing her arm over my shoulders. We stumbled backward toward the massive, smoking fusion generator at the compound's center. The Kelari, bred and trained to fight to the bitter end rather than retreat, hesitated, but seeing their commander pulled backward with me broke through that hesitation just enough. The perimeter collapsed inward, funneling toward the generator housing, and the Skrell surged into the abandoned courtyard behind us in a hissing, clicking sea of chitin and hunger. They had us cornered against the reactor. "They have us," Harper panted, armor scarred and dented, blood leaking freely down one cheek. She looked at me with a strange, sorrowful acceptance in her glowing eyes. You fought well, Ronald. A Skrell drone broke off from the main swarm and came straight for me, low and fast, sidelimb already raised for the strike. I didn't have time to bring my rifle up. I threw myself sideways instead, felt the limb pass close enough to slice open the shoulder seam of my hazard suit without touching skin, and hit the ground hard on my bad shoulder from the SETI Alpha crash landing. Vex, reloading 3 feet away, put the drone down with a single round through its exposed thorax before it could correct and come back for a second pass. She didn't say anything about it. She just kept reloading. I'm not done fighting, Harper. I dropped Diana gently against the reactor housing and spun around, tearing the maintenance panel off with my bare hands. What are you doing? Lyra demanded, dragging a wounded Sky behind the shielding. The Skrell hunt by bioelectric signature and seismic vibration. Right, I said, my hands already flying across the reactor's control grid, ripping out safety limiter after safety limiter. Yes, Diana wheezed from where she was slumped against the housing. Why? Because I'm about to give them a sensory overload they will never, ever forget. I pulled a plasma grenade off my belt, jammed it directly into the exposed cooling manifold, and set the timer for 10 seconds. Brace yourselves, I shouted. Get behind the blast shielding now. I grabbed Diana and threw myself over her, bracing against the thick metal lip of the reactor housing. Lyra and Harper hit the deck beside us, dragging Sky between them. 3, 2, 1. The explosion didn't just rattle my teeth. It felt like the planet itself had cracked open. Because I'd stripped out the safety limiters first, the plasma grenade didn't produce a simple fiery blast. It triggered a massive, localized electromagnetic pulse riding on top of a concussive shockwave. A dome of blinding blue energy tore through the courtyard, and the EMP hit the Skrell's sensitive bioelectric nervous systems like a hammer. The shrieking stopped all at once. I lifted my head slowly, ears ringing so badly I genuinely thought I'd gone deaf. Dust hung thick in the air, backlit by the dying purple sky. When it settled, the courtyard was littered with twitching, paralyzed Skrell, not dead, but completely, thoroughly incapacitated, their nervous systems fried past the point of coordinated movement. The Kellari slowly climbed to their feet, armor caked in dust and insect gore. Lyra kicked a massive Skrell warrior experimentally. It only spasmed in response. Harper looked at the devastated courtyard, then at the smoking wreck of the reactor, and finally down at me, still kneeling over their wounded commander with foam sealant drying on my hands. Diana groaned and pushed herself upright, looking first at the sealant patch holding her chest together, then at the field of paralyzed enemies stretching across the courtyard, and finally at me. For a long moment, the only sound was wind moving through the canyon. Then something in the room shifted, something I felt before I understood it. The Kellari are a predatory, pack-oriented species. They respect dominance. They revere survival above almost everything else. In their culture, a male is something fragile, something to be sheltered and protected. I had just dragged their matriarch out of a kill zone, outsmarted an entire swarm, and turned a fusion react. Or into a weapon with my bare hands and a stripped-down toolkit. Diana reached out and closed her hand around my shoulder. It wasn't the rough, dismissive grip from my first day in the barracks. It was firm, anchoring, deeply, unmistakably possessive. You, she rumbled, her voice carrying a strange mixture of awe and raw intensity I hadn't heard from her before, are no mere engineer, Ronald Pendleton. Lyra stepped closer, her glowing eyes fixed on me with an intensity that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Harper moved to my other side, leaning down until her face was inches from mine, and I realized with a slow, sinking feeling in my stomach that the dynamic in that courtyard hadn't just changed. It had inverted completely. They didn't see me as a fragile liability anymore. They saw me as something rare, something dangerous, something worth keeping. The Terran extraction shuttles arrived 20 minutes later, breaking through the bruised purple clouds like chrome angels, showing up embarrassingly late to their own rescue. By the time the coalition medics hit the ground, the last of the Skrell had either been finished off by a reinvigorated Lyra or had retreated into the tunnels beneath the outpost. I was sitting on an overturned munitions crate, covered head to toe in alien viscera, engine grease, and my own sweat, when a human medic jogged toward me waving a bioscanner. Before he got within 10 feet, a massive armored arm blocked his path. Specialist Harper. Her armor was scorched, a nasty gash still leaking blue fluid down one cheek, but her amber eyes had locked onto that medic with a lethal, unblinking intensity. "The human is ours," she growled, her translator collar rendering the territorial edge in her voice with unsettling accuracy. "Step back, coalition." "I just need to check his vitals, specialist," the medic stammered, clearly recalculating his life choices as he stared up at her. "He is uninjured," Harper said. "He requires rest, not your prodding." I had to step in before the poor guy lost an arm over a routine checkup. "Stand down, Harper. Let him do his job." She complied instantly, a detail I clocked and filed away for later, stepping aside, but never taking her eyes off the medic until he'd finished, patched the one real scrape on my forearm, and beat a hasty retreat toward the wounded Kellari waiting nearby. The flight back to Aegis Prime felt surreal. Normally, that dropship was a space of solemn silence or gruff military posturing. This time, the entire atmosphere seemed to orbit around me. Every glowing eye that caught mine darted away, only to snap right back the moment I looked elsewhere. Lyra, who 3 weeks earlier had offered to break my spine in the gravity chamber, tossed me an extra high-calorie ration bar from her personal stash, a gesture, I'd later learn, roughly equivalent to a formal declaration of pack bonding. Commander Diana was rushed straight to the trauma ward on landing. Her injuries were serious, but Kellari physiology is notoriously resilient, and the medics were cautiously optimistic within the hour. I went back to the barracks expecting the adrenaline crash to hit and leave me hollowed out with post-combat shock. Instead, I found the entire social ecosystem of Sector 7 had rearranged itself around me. My bunk, previously exiled to the drafty, dim corner of the barracks, had been physically relocated, centered in the room, flanked by Lyra's and Harper's bunks on either side. Someone had polished my boots. Someone else had left a beautifully forged combat knife on my pillow, its blade carved from a Skrell Alpha's carapace. At mealtimes, my squadmates naturally formed a defensive perimeter around my table, and if anyone from another squad so much as glanced my direction, two long, low, guttural warning growls rippled through the group. I was no longer the frail human liability who'd wandered through the blast doors 3 weeks earlier. I was, apparently, a tactical genius, a savior of their matriarch, and in a way I was only starting to understand a prize to be guarded jealously. It was flattering. It was also deeply, primally terrifying in roughly equal measure. Small things kept giving it away over the next 2 days. Someone had reprogrammed the mess hall's ration dispenser to flag my usual order as priority, which meant I never once had to wait in line again, a privilege that got me some genuinely murderous looks from soldiers who'd been on base for years. My laundry came back folded in a manner no Terran quartermaster had ever bothered with. Even the base's automated lighting schedule seemed to have quietly shifted. The section of barracks nearest my bunk stayed dimmer during rest hours than regulation called for, which Skye eventually admitted, without a trace of embarrassment, was because Harper had lodged 3 separate maintenance requests claiming the overhead panel above my cot was defective. It wasn't. It had never been defect. C-Dive. I brought it up with Lyra over breakfast on the second morning, mostly out of curiosity rather than complaint. She didn't even look up from her ration tray. "You are packed now," she said, like that explained the ration dispenser, the laundry, and the lighting all at once. In her mind, apparently, it did. The true twist of my situation was waiting for me at the base communications center on my third day back. I was summoned to the Coalition Liaison office and walked into a sterile, overlit room to find a holographic projection of Major Richard Thomas, a senior intelligence officer from Terran High Command, already waiting. "Private Pendleton," Thomas said, adjusting his glasses, "I see you survived your temporary reassignment." "Barely, sir," I replied, standing at parade rest. "I assume my transfer paperwork has finally cleared the log jam." Thomas paused, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten before he even opened his mouth again. "Ronald, I need to be fully transparent with you. There was no clerical error. Logistics Officer Peterson didn't make a mistake." I felt the blood drain out of my face. "Sir." 2 years ago, General Mattis of Terran Strategic Command authored a classified white paper, Thomas explained, his tone shifting into something clinical and detached. He theorized that as coalition integration with the Kalari matriarchy deepens, we will face significant command structure friction. They're rigid, strength-based, deeply traditional. High Command needed to know whether human adaptability, specifically, human ingenuity under crisis conditions, could override their biological and cultural bias against outsiders. DARPA and High Command jointly greenlit a field study. The realization landed like a physical blow. I was a test subject. "You were a test subject for a sociological integration doctrine," Thomas corrected, with a gentleness that somehow made it worse. "We needed to know whether a standard Terran male, armed with nothing but engineering skills and endurance, could earn a place inside their most elite, most xenophobic unit. Frankly, Ronald, we expected you to fail. We expected the Vanguard to request your removal within the week." "You put my life on the line for a research paper," I said, anger flaring somewhere under the exhaustion. "I could have died on SETI Alpha." "You signed a standard enlistment waiver, Private," Thomas said, his tone hardening slightly. "But the experiment concluded successfully. Your results exceeded every projection we modeled. You've proven the doctrine viable in live-fire conditions. We're pulling you out. A transport arrives in 6 hours to return you to the 104th. You're being promoted to sergeant, and you'll receive a commendation for your actions at Outpost Charlie. Pack your gear." "And the Vanguard?" I asked. "What happens to them once your data set is complete?" Thomas hesitated, which told me more than anything he actually said next. "The Kalari integration doctrine will inform staffing decisions across 17 joint outposts over the next fiscal cycle. Your unit will likely see additional Terran personnel rotated in as a result of what you demonstrated. So they don't get a say in who gets rotated into their barracks based on a study they never consented to being part of." "Command structures rarely ask permission, Ronald," Thomas said, not unkindly. "You know that better than most people wearing that uniform." "I know it," I said. "I don't have to like it." "Understood. For what it's worth, and I recognize it may not be worth much right now, the data you generated will likely save Terran lives down the line. Fewer friction incidents during joint deployments. Fewer casualties from command breakdowns during first contact scenarios with allied forces. That's the entire point of the doctrine." That's a very tidy way of describing 4 people who nearly died on SETI Alpha because High Command wanted a data point. Thomas didn't have an answer for that one, and to his credit, he didn't try to manufacture one. He simply nodded once, said the transport would be waiting, and let the connection close. The hologram flickered and died, leaving me alone in the silent comms room with the hum of climate control and the sudden, unwelcome sound of my own heartbeat. I should have been thrilled. A promotion, a medal, a ticket out of an assignment that had, by any reasonable metric, nearly got me killed. I was going back to turning wrenches and drinking bad synthetic coffee alongside people who didn't look at me like I was simultaneously a war hero and a very valuable piece of property. So why did it feel like the floor had dropped out from under me? I walked back to Sector 7 with a weight in my chest I couldn't quite name. The crimson and silver banners hung proudly over the blast doors, same as the day I'd first arrived, except now the sight of them made my stomach twist rather than sink. The moment I stepped inside, the low hum of alien conversation cut off. 20 pairs of glowing eyes turned toward me, warm and expectant, the way a family looks up when you walk through the front door. I crossed to my newly centered bunk and pulled my duffel bag out from underneath it, tossing my sparse belongings inside one at a time. Data pad, multi-tool, the Skrill carapace knife. "What are you doing, Ronald?" I turned. Sergeant Lyra stood at the foot of my bed, and even the translator couldn't fully mask the sudden, sharp tension underneath her voice. Harper appeared a heartbeat later, dropping her plasma rifle onto her own bunk to cross her arms, amber eyes narrowing. "I got my orders," I said quietly, not quite meeting either of their eyes. "The transfer finally came through. I'm reassigned back to the 104th. Shuttle leaves in 5 hours." Silence fell over the barracks again, but not the dismissive silence from my first day. This was heavier, the kind of silence that sits right before a storm breaks. "No," Lyra said, one word. It carried the weight of a physical blow. "It's not up to me, Lyra," I said, zipping the bag shut. "High Command signed off on it." "You are human," Harper said. "Your place is with coalition forces." Before I could get a hand on the duffel straps, Harper closed the distance between us in a blur, her massive clawed hand clamping down over mine, pinning it flat against the canvas. Her grip was iron-hard and immovable, and yet somehow, impossibly, gentle. "You belong to the vanguard," she rumbled, leaning down until her face was inches from mine. "You bleed with us, you fight with us, you are ours." "Harper, let go," I said, though I'll admit my voice didn't carry much conviction behind it. "She will not," a booming voice said from the doorway. The crowd of gray-skinned warriors parted like a curtain pulling back. Commander Diana stepped into the barracks, out of her armor now, wearing a loose medical tunic, thick white bandages wrapped tight across her chest, leaning heavily on a metal cane. Even wounded, even out of uniform, her presence filled the room the exact same way it had on the day I first met her. She crossed the floor slowly, her glowing eyes fixed entirely on me, and stopped directly in front of my bunk, towering over my 6-foot frame the way she had on my very first day in Sector 7. "Commander," I said, straightening, "you should be in the trauma ward. And you should be calibrating my unit's plasma rifles, Ronald," she said smoothly. "I intercepted a transmission from Major Thomas. He believes he can simply summon you back to his little Terran sandbox. He believes the Vanguard was a temporary assignment. It was a DARPA experiment." "Commander," I admitted, deciding there was no point holding it back any longer, "they put me here to see if I'd survive your culture. They used me. And in a way, they used you too." Diana's expression didn't shift, but I felt a low, dangerous hum building in her chest before she spoke again. "Terran High Command is foolish if it believes it can play games with Kelari Pack law," she said. "They sent you as an experiment, but the battlefield does not care about laboratories, Ronald. The battlefield only cares about who stands beside you when the ground breaks open beneath your feet." She reached out, her massive hand closing gently around my chin, tilting my head up until I had no choice but to meet her eyes directly. "You saved my life," she said, her voice carrying through the entire silent barracks. "By Kelari law, you have proven your dominance over the enemy and your value to this pack. You are not a human engineer anymore, Ronald Pendleton. You are the Vanguard's prime." "Commander, if I don't board that shuttle, I'll be court-martialed for going AWOL," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs harder than it had at any point during the actual firefight. Diana let out a dark, rumbling laugh. "Let them try. The Terran coalition needs the Kelari on the front lines far more than it needs one engineer's paperwork filed correctly. They will not risk a diplomatic incident over you, especially not when I invoke the right of Kalan. I blinked. The right of what? Our oldest law, Lyra said from behind me, a smug edge bleeding through her translator. It states that a warrior who brings a mate into the fold through trial by combat claims him under the protection of the matriarch. You are no longer under coalition jurisdiction, Ronald. You are Kelari property, specifically our property. I looked around the room. Dozens of heavily armed, fiercely protective alien warriors were watching me with an expression that mixed predatory hunger with something that looked, unmistakably, like devotion. I thought about the 104th, the sterile forward bases, the synthetic coffee, the bureaucracy that treated soldiers like line items on a spreadsheet instead of people. Then I looked at Diana, who had physically dragged herself out of a hospital bed on a cane to stop me from leaving. These women were terrifying, violent, overbearing, entirely comically too tall for any doorway in the compound, but they respected me, they protected me, and in this chaotic, blood-soaked corner of the galaxy they genuinely, fiercely wanted me to stay. I pulled my hand free from under Harper's grip slowly and looked at my open duffel bag for a long moment. Then I unzipped it the rest of the way, pulled out my multi-tool, and tossed the bag back under the cot. Lyra, I said, turning to the sergeant, your plasma cannon's heat sink is still cycling 10 seconds too slow. If we don't fix it before the next drop, it's going to melt your gauntlet straight to the chassis. A collective, vibrating purr of approval rolled through the barracks, strong enough that I felt it in the floor plating beneath my boots. Diana smiled, a terrifying, toothy, genuinely warm expression I hadn't seen from her before that moment. Welcome home, Ronald. Major Thomas did not take my refusal well. 3 separate transmissions came through the liaison office over the following week, each one climbing steadily up the chain of command, each one demanding my return under increasingly formal language. General Matties himself eventually got on a secure channel to explain, in the patient tone people use when they think you haven't grasped the seriousness of a situation, that invoking an alien tribal custom to dodge a lawful transfer order was not, in fact, a valid defense under Terran military law. Diana attended that call standing directly behind me, arms crossed, silent, 7 feet of scarred gray muscle radiating a very clear and very specific message. Matties never quite managed to finish his sentence about disciplinary proceedings. He rescheduled the call twice, then quietly let the matter drop into the kind of bureaucratic limbo that, I'd come to learn, could apparently swallow anything if you left it alone long enough. Peterson's original typo had got me here. It seemed only fitting that the same institutional inertia that created the problem was the thing that finally let me stay. 6 weeks later, the coalition made it official rather than fight a fight it clearly didn't want. I was reclassified as a coalition liaison engineer, permanently attached to the 4th Vanguard, with a mandate broad enough that nobody back on Earth could quite figure out how to reassign me again, even if they'd wanted to. Lyra printed the transfer order out on actual paper, a genuine rarity on a military base running on data pads, and pinned it above my bunk like a hunting trophy. Life in Sector 7 didn't get gentler after that. If anything, expectations climbed. Diana started including me in tactical planning sessions I had no formal business sitting in on, mostly, I think, because she decided my habit of looking at problems sideways was worth more than my rank suggested. Vex taught me, over several deeply unpleasant weeks, how to strip and reassemble a Kelari heavy cannon blindfolded, a skill I have never once needed and have never once regretted learning. Harper took to disappearing on solo reconnaissance runs and returning with small, oddly thoughtful items. A rare mineral sample, a data crystal loaded with pre-war human music she'd somehow tracked down, a replacement strap for my rifle sling after the old one finally gave out. Kelari courtship, I was slowly discovering, ran less on words and more on a running tally of small, deliberate acts, and I was losing track of the score. Sergeant Doyle, for what it's worth, transferred out of Aegis Prime entirely about 2 months later. Nobody in Sector 7 ever confirmed involvement, and I never asked. The Skrell hit us twice more before the season was out, smaller engagements, nothing on the scale of Outpost Charlie, but enough that the EMP trick I'd used in a moment of desperation became standard doctrine across 3 Allied outposts inside a single quarter. Coalition Engineering Command sent a formal request asking me to write up the modification as an official field manual addendum. I did. I made sure to note, in the very first line, that it only worked because a Kelari sergeant trusted an untested human enough to pull the trigger on my say-so with half the squad already down. Diana's scars from Outpost Charlie never fully faded, though Kelari physiology closed the wound itself within a month. She kept the medical tunic she'd worn the night she talked me out of boarding that shuttle, folded at the bottom of her footlocker, which Lyra told me, in the tone of someone passing along classified intelligence, was not something Kelari commanders typically held onto for sentimental reasons. I never asked Diana about it directly. Some things in that unit, I'd learned, were better understood by what wasn't said than by what was. On the 6-month anniversary of Peterson's typo, Lyra presented me with a small engraved plate to hang beside my bunk, listing my name Alon. G-side a string of Kelari characters my translator rendered roughly, as the one who stayed when leaving would have been easier. I hung it up without comment, because by then I'd learned that was exactly how you were supposed to receive it. Epilogue. I didn't mean to join the vanguard. It started as a clerical accident and turned into a twisted sociological experiment engineered by generals sitting comfortably light years from anything resembling danger. But as I sat on my bunk that night, surrounded by 47-foot alien warriors who would gladly burn down an entire star system to keep me safe, I realized something I never expected to admit. I'd won the bureaucratic lottery. I am the only human in the Kelari vanguard, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going anywhere. Outrow/call to action. What a wild ride that was for Ronald. Trapped by a single typo, he didn't just survive an elite alien sisterhood. He earned their respect, saved their commander, and became the most fiercely protected human in the entire galaxy. If you enjoyed this HFY sci-fi drama, smash that like button, share it with your fellow sci-fi fans, and subscribe for more of Ronald's story. Because trust me, the Vanguard's prime is just getting started. What would you have done in Ronald's shoes? Let me know in the comments below.